Hi, I'm Stéphanie Walter and we're here today at Clarity to talk about accessibility and documenting interaction for designers. I have to start this talk with a bad news. A lot of websites were sadly not designed or even developed with accessibility needs in mind. As designers, we tend to think that accessibility is, air quotes, the job of the developer. So accessibility became an afterthought. Company launch inaccessible projects, inaccessible websites. And then the team gets asked to fix it later. The issue is, why would you want to fix something when you could design it the right way to start with? This is why I think we need to bring accessibility awareness earlier in the project. And I think design documentation can help us achieve that. So the first question is usually how and where do I document accessibility and interactions? Well, I use a lot of annotations in my project, so let me walk through a little bit through my own projects. We have two kinds of files. We have documentation at component level. So this is what you have here on the left of my screen. I put design annotation directly on the components of the mockup to help developers understand how this works for interaction, but also for accessibility. So it can be, for instance, little arrows to make them understand how it's supposed to work, but also some keyboard documentation in here. I also created some sketch templates for annotation. So this is what you have on the right of my screen here. I have boxes, arrows, and everything I need. I can just drag and drop those directly in the mockup to document it very quickly. I have a second type of documentation, which is at page levels. So at page level, I usually will duplicate the page. So here on the left of my screen, at the top you have the page. I remove the confidential information, and at the bottom it's the exact same page, but this time I have some annotation, something specific for my developers. Again, about accessibility, but also about interactions. My advice here, when creating such annotation, make sure that the annotation style is different from your visual identity. This is why mine are magenta, because I'm not using magenta anywhere on this website. I want to make sure that my developers understand this is annotation and this should not be implemented. And I know usually this makes people laugh, but I've seen it before, like developers would implement annotation. So make sure you have something different enough, also communicate with them. So while searching for this talk, I stumbled upon Karen Hawkins' accessibility annotation example, and I find her format quite interesting. On my left screen here, I have at the bottom of the page the mockup, and on top of it, she has this little blue area with some dots. And the dots correspond to some notes in the margin on the right here. So in dark black, you have classic annotation for anything, and then in red, prefix with AR for accessibility requirement, she has all the accessibility annotation. That's how Karen and I document. But if you want your documentation to be useful and used by your team, you need to make sure that you do something that works best for them. There can be a lot of different formats. You could document using Jira tickets, Confluence, Word documents, PDF, Excel sheets, whatever, even mockups directly on Figma file. The goal is talk to your team and ask them about the best format to make sure that it's going to be used. And remember, this is not a substitute for communicating with people. Even if you have the greatest documentation in the world, you still need to present it in person. In my team, we have those wiki meetings, where developers, they would show the demos, and I would go there, show and discuss about documentation, about mockups, about specification, to make sure we are all aligned. So I shared the how and the where should we document. Let's dig in the meat of the talk, the actual examples of what could or should designer document when it comes to accessibility. To help us digest this information, I split the talk in 4 different categories: visual design, interactions, wayfinding, and announced content and markup. Let's start with the visual aspect, which is usually the first thing designers think about when documenting. You can document the color palette for your website. And what I like to do for accessibility is actually to have a color matrix that will help me understand what color can I pair together? So on my screen here, I have my color palette. I have the same color at the top and at the bottom here. So top, bottom, and at the intersection of those, I have the contrast ratio. So to give you an example, the yellow, I cannot use it with a white text or as a white background. It doesn't pass the inner, it's not contrasted enough. But I could use it with the dark purple or even with one of those shades of grays. So the goal of that is really to help the designers project on what color can we combine and which one should we not. I can also be a little bit more explicit sometimes. So I could document this directly in some components. For instance, here I have a success component and I have 4 variants of green. I have a dark main, light, and contrast text. And yet, some of those names don't make sense because I reused it from the Material UI guidelines that we have. So what I have here is basically, I'm telling to my team that I can use the dark with the contrast text. Either I use the dark as a background and the contrast text, or white as a text, or the other way around. One thing though is not all designers are familiar with the notion of contrast ratio. What's AA, AAA, large text, small text, what does it all mean? So you might want to put some documentation about that somewhere. This is Gary Reed's website, and she has this Webpack for Designer amazing article. And by the way, my notes will be online, so don't worry, you'll get a link to all the things I'm showing you today. Let's talk about interaction. So for interactive components, let's say buttons, for instance, there's a lot of things I can document, but the first thing is the state. So here I have an example of a button, and I've documented the default state first, then the hover, the focus, the active, and the disabled state. If I'm going into more complex components, like for instance checkboxes and radio buttons, I also have default focus checked. I have then extra steps like disable, disable checked, indeterminate because we need those in my design system, disabled, indeterminate, and same for my radio button. So all of this documentation, it is done at component level. For more complex things like input text, I have the generic one. So I have again my default, my focus, my field, my read only. But I also need some extra statuses. What happens when there's an error? What happens when there's a success, like the error is corrected? Information message, stuff like that. So I'm also documenting those. So for input at component level, I can also have my generic state. So I have default, focus, field, and read only. And focus is really important for accessibility because it helps screen reader users know where they are when I'm navigating using a keyboard. But then I need some extra things. I need some specific statuses. For instance, error message, like what happens if the user feels it wrongly, success if they correct the error, information, and stuff like that. So those, I can also document them at component level. And then at page level, which is on the right here, I have the same component, but they use in a page. So here I'm more specific. I'm basically explaining what's the error case, and I'm also giving the exact text, like please enter a number, for example, 2022, something like that. So there's always kind of two documentation, generic one at component level versus where the component is used more kind of in context documentation. Okay, let's bring back my super complex component again. So for complex component with a lot of interaction, what I like to build is those interaction flow, which shows how it should work. So let's start with mouse interaction. I document step by step what happens when the user opens the component here. Then if they hover one of those little areas, what happens when they click? What happens when they have multiple clicks? What happens when they click on the apply button, etc., etc. So I'm really like cutting down this component in small little steps to have everything I need for my developers. So this is mouse. And then we have keyboard interaction, which is basically me duplicating kind of the same thing and then explaining how is it supposed to work with the keyboard navigation. So how do we open the components? Press space, enter. You can press escape if you want to close it. And then it's the same. How do you navigate between the different elements with the key down up? How do you go to the next one using the tabulation, etc., etc. Providing alternative for complex gesture is an accessibility best practice, but also a usability one. One of those complex gesture is, for instance, a swipe. In Gmail, you have swipe right to archive something. If I were to document alternatives for Gmail, I would do something like that. So first on the left, I have my classic complex gesture, I swipe right. Then I have one alternative, which is I press long on the email, and then the little toolbar at the top appears, and the user can just click this archive icon. And then the second alternative would be open the email. You have always the toolbar at the top, and then you can again archive. So the goal is not to have many different gestures, but it's to always have kind of a simpler gesture in case of complex one, like swipe, zoom, things like that. Let's talk about zoom level. For complex page, you could also document the zoom behavior. So the best practice is user needs to be able to zoom up to 20% without destroying the page. Basically, you can't have stuff that is hidden, things like that. I will not necessarily document that for website because we always have responsive guidelines. We talk to the developer, we told them, don't block the zoom, make sure you test with the website zoom and stuff like that. But I think it could make sense to document such things for native applications. So here I have an example borrowed from Goulven Baron from Maïf. On the left, it's the FAQ in French with regular zoom, and then 20% what happens is those buttons, instead of being kind of grid of 4, they just wrap and stack on top of each other. Okay, one aspect of design that is really tricky to document is animations. And again, we have accessibility guidelines for animation. You need to understand that some animation might trigger motion sickness to users with vestibular disorders. I'm one of them. I can't play some video games because of that. So what you can use in CSS is prefers reduced motion to provide, again, an alternative with less animation. To give you an example, on my website, I have my face with 3 little thingy floating around my face here. And when I scroll down, I have this flower that is basically growing. And this is a triggering animation because I scroll down, the flower goes up. So with prefers reduced motion set to on, what I did is I removed the floating animation around my head. So no more animation for that. And then when you scroll down the page, I have a fade in. This is a less triggering animation than the whole thing moving one way and something is moving the other way around. The tricky part is documenting those. Here I would be saying, talk to the developers. Explain to them what you expect. Test it directly in the browser. Fine-tune with your dev team directly in the browser. Discuss with the team. That's kind of the easiest way. Also, don't forget, if you have things that are playing, auto-playing on a website like sliders or video, users should have a way to pause them, though. So don't forget about play, pause buttons when you are doing the designs and the documentation. So this was component level. At the level of the page, there is one last thing I can document, which is user flow. So user flow here on the left is kind of a step-by-step box and arrow graph that documents how someone will accomplish a task through my whole application. So I list the pages, I list some branchings, like, do they have an account? Yes, then we go to login page. No, then we go to account creation, stuff like that. They're usually done at the beginning of the project. Screen flow on the right here, it's basically the same, but I removed the little boxes and I put the actual mobile device mockups in there. So it's really interesting because they will help my developer understand how someone is going to navigate. Regarding accessibility, it can help plan a few things. So if you're doing a native application or a single page app, you can document transition between the pages. You can also have sometimes alerts that should persist between one page and another. Then having this kind of whole map of all the pages can be quite interesting. Let's talk about wayfinding, which is documentation that will help people find their way and navigate in the page. Let's start with page title. So what you need to understand is the page title, so the actual HTML page title, you will see it in the browser tab at the top. but it will be the first thing announced by a screen reader. So this will help screen reader users understand what can they actually expect from this page. So here for the documentation on my project, we put that in Jira. Basically, we have a giant Jira ticket with kind of an Excel spreadsheet where we document all the structure of all the HTML page titles that we have in the app. So this is a complex web app with a lot of pages. You could also document this directly in the mockup if you wanted to. Another thing designers can document is skip links. So skip to content links. It's a link that is usually hidden by default, but it doesn't have to. And when the user will start navigating using a keyboard navigation or a screen reader, they will be able to trigger that link to go directly to the content. So the goal of those links is to make sure that the user doesn't have to go through yet another round of navigation if they want to go directly to the content. So those are often invisible by default, but you could always also have them visible. That's up to you as a designer to decide. What you can document is where the link is. So here my link is at the top left. It's coming on top of the logo of my website. And then where should it send the user? So here it's going to send the user to the main area of my fake cooking recipe website. So the skip content is just one of those links, and you can send them to a specific area in the page. In the documentation of area, you have something that is called area landmarks. And again, those are specific area you can document on the page that will help user with screen reader understand what's available on the page and kind of the global structure of the page. So I really like this because it's kind of inception. So this is the website that is the area documentation where it shows its own area landmarks. So you have, you skip to content link here, that goes to the main, but you have other ones like banner, complementary, navigation, region, and etc., etc. This is a little bit more technical, so I would say as designers, you might not be able to document those directly. Maybe check with accessibility experts or developers to do so. Then once we are inside the page, you also need proper HTML heading structure. I mean H1, H2, H3, and all of those. This can be documented as well. So as a designer, I can usually do two things. The first thing I usually do is when I'm doing my style, I will name them according to the proper layer. So I have H1 styles, H2 styles, H3 styles, etc. And then on the mockup directly, I can also kind of duplicate this information and say, this is my mobile version of my cooking recipe. Gluten-free pizza should be H1. Ingredient is H2, preparation step is H2, and then each of the steps is an H3. So again, this can be documented on your own as a designer, but also maybe with the help of other content people, UX writers, SEO people, things like that. Some people will also navigate a website without using a mouse, using tabulation key. So the focus order should follow the logic of the flow of the page. And this can be documented as well, especially if you start having super complex pages like dashboards and things like that. On my screen, I have an example of a Microsoft Fluent Design System, and they're documenting this on kind of a SharePoint page. So here they're again using the annotation to explain that the user should go through here in the focus. So we start at the top of the page, we go through it all until here, then we enter in the second area from the left to right, then we have the navigation, then strangely we go to the return. I don't know why, but that's Microsoft decision. And then we go through the little area at the top, and then only then do we enter in the actual table of the page. So I agree that for kind of a basic website with not a lot of interaction, you might not need to document this. But here you have something quite complex. And sometimes developer might wonder, okay, what's the focus order going to be? So you can document this at page level. At component level, you could also do something like that. So this is an example of a 2-column contact form. And I'm explaining that the user should go through it left to right, top to bottom. So we start with, where are you? What is your request about? Your email address. Then we go on the right side of the form for your message and send email. So here I'm again documenting it with leader arrows. If you're using Figma, There's a plugin called Accessibility Focus Order, built by Microsoft. And it's quite nice because it lets you put the annotation directly in here. And then if you change your mind, you can always reorder the numbers and it will reorder it on the markup. So it's really a big gain of time because then you don't need to do it manually. I did it once manually and then I forgot 11 between 10 and 12 and then I had to move all the numbers. So doing it manually is a little bit annoying. If you can use the Figma plugin, it's big gain of time. So last category is content and markup. If you have images that make sense, that if you need to convey the sense and the content of an image, you can document it as well. So you can document what the assistive technology, screen reader, is supposed to read to the user. Here I have again my cooking recipe websites. Let's start with the big image. On the left, I have this amazing image of a pizza. So what I'm documenting is I'm using annotation to say, okay, this should be the alternative text for my pizza. Then I have 3 buttons. I have save, share, and rate. The trick here is each button have an icon, so technically it's an image, and they have a label. But since they have a label, I actually don't need to document the icons. Otherwise, the screen reader would see save, save, share, share. It might be a little bit annoying. So what I'm doing is I'm basically saying we do not need the screen reader to vocalize anything for those because they have a label. So here I assume that I had full control over the HTML of my cooking recipe. On real website, most of the time, this might be user-generated content. They might use a CMS or WYSIWYG. So in the background here, I have an example of a WordPress image uploader. So what you need to understand is if you have images and you need to have alternative text, at some point, if you're dealing with content management system, you need to provide an area, a space for the users who will actually input the content for the alt text. So in WordPress, you have it on the left. Here you can have alternative text and I can say a slice of pizza with something, something, something. I was in the middle of writing it. I'm not going to go into details. There's, if you're interested into accessibility for CMS, WYSIWYGs, and stuff like that, there's a tag, authoring tool accessibility guidelines, that you could check. So my first example, I had a label with the icon, so I didn't need to announce anything. Here I have a second example, which is a tile of a table, HTML table at the bottom. And in the corner here, I have what we call a toggle, and you can toggle between view graph and view tab. Since we don't have any label here, I need to announce something. So my screen reader, for the first one, will say view graph, and for the second one, it will say view table, so to help users understand what they can do. One thing you can document is the announced content order, which is the order in which the screen reader will announce the thing on the page. This is interesting when the visual order is a little bit different from the HTML flow. Please note though that most of the time you want them to be the same. You want visual order to match announced content order, so be very careful when you change those. I built a specific example for that, where I have my cooking recipe thumbnail component, so it looks like a card. At the top, I have my image, and on top of this image, I have the little save button. Then I have the categories, the title, and I have the description in here. And what I want to do here is actually I want the title to be announced first. So gluten-free pizza with a bigger name. Because it's bigger, I change the font size. So I have kind of visual hierarchy built in these components, and I want to convey to the screen reader this visual hierarchy. I left the alternative text empty because this is a card component that will be used on search result page with tons of other pizza recipes. And while discussing with an accessibility expert, she said, yeah, but it will be annoying if it kind of reads all the images all the time. So do not have an alt text for this one. This can be debated. That's the tricky part with alternative text, is not all experts agree on what should and should not be done and how you should do that. So to be discussed maybe. So the order I want to have is first the title, number 1. Then I want the categories. Number 3 will be the summary, and then the save. Even if it's visually at the top, I want this to be announced last. The only reason is it makes sense to save it only once you read the rest. And then it's just like put in here using CSS absolute positioning on top of the tile, just in order to kind of win some space. Sometimes the clickable part of an element is not that obvious. So this happens when you have complex link with a lot of elements. Here in my example, I have again my little tile, and inside it we have something that we call entity link, which is linked to different entities in my system. And it has a little icon, it has a text, it has a number, and it has a little arrow. And when I tell to my developer, okay, we need to put a link, the first question that might happen is, yeah, where do I put a link? On the title, on the arrow? And the answer is on the whole element. So if you have complex elements and you need links wrapped around them, it can be good to document or at least communicate with the developer where is the link supposed to be. And you don't need to document that in design documentation. You can also just put it in a Jira ticket, something like that. Then sometimes you need some little extra information for screen reader users. So in my navigation at the top, I have documents and I have tasks, and those can have a little badge to say how many new documents and how many new tasks do you have. The thing is, if the screen reader only reads the little number, it might be a little bit confusing, like you would say docs 5, something like that. So what we decided to have is to have extra information for the screen reader. So if there's no document, it says no new documents. If we have 5 or another number, it should say 5 new documents, and the same for tasks. No new tasks, 5 new tasks. So we are actually adding some information to be a little bit more explicit, but here again, it's about translating to the screen reader what someone can have visually by seeing this little badge on top of an icon. So those were design documentation. You can go sometimes some step further if you start working with developers and accessibility experts directly. What you could document is, for instance, correct HTML semantics. Do we need a button? Do we need a href link? Area roles, area states, area properties. I won't enter in the details, but if you start talking to accessibility experts, they can help you with those. To give you another example, so here again I have some of my components and I'm documenting what is the correct HTML5 type. So for our select, we decided that we are not going to build a custom select, so we say we are going to use the HTML native option element. Same for date picker, we're not going to build a custom one, we will just put an input type equal date and get the date picker from free from the browser. For the search, it's the same. Type equals search, and we get the little box to remove the search query. So again, this might be a little bit beyond designer documentation. You can talk directly with developers, and maybe this should be in the development documentation. Really depends on your team. The last thing that you can document, but you can't really put it in the mockups, is links to external sources. Like if you have a podcast, you want audio transcription of what people are saying. If you're doing recording of videos, things like that, you need to have some subtitles. And again, you can't put that in the design documentation. So usually you need a place with external links for all of these alternatives for the multimedia content. So who should document all of that? Because I told you about design documentation, but it goes a little bit beyond that. I have two answers. It's a team effort and it depends, because designers love to answer it depends. Different people in the team can document different things, like the product or project management team. They can already document what do we target for the accessibility. Do we target AA, AAA? They can put accessibility as a requirement of the project. This should help a lot. They can also decide to make accessibility part of the definition of done, things like that. So they can already document a few things to push accessibility forward. Designers, they can document what I just showed you and talk to you about, like navigation, hidden interaction, assistive technology announcement, and stuff like that. Developers, accessibility experts, they can document the technical implementation, markup, area, landmarks. But then you can also have UX writers or SEO content people. Those people, they can help with alternative text. They can also help with call to actions, because it's very bad for SEO, accessibility, and usability to have a click here link. You want to have something more specific, and those people can help with that. And then we have my dear and beloved QA and testing team. So at some point, someone has to test the accessibility. So you can have accessibility testing part of the QA phase. So a lot of people can actually document a lot of things, which should help bring accessibility forward in the project. My advice here as to who should document what, start with what your team members are comfortable with. Then build upon those bases. Maybe some people need some training, things like that, but start with asking people what they know already, and then you can expand. So for me, what I did while preparing this talk is I tried to organize what can I as a designer document. And I built this kind of 3-quadrant matrix. So I have everything that I feel comfortable as a designer documenting myself. Then I have stuff that I need the help of developers and accessibility experts with. And I have the things I need the help of UX writer, SEO people to document. And I have some things in the middle, which is, it depends. Maybe if I read a little bit, I can document on my own, but I would prefer to have the help of experts. So I really like this matrix because it shows what I can do. I would advise to you to do something kind of similar for your team. Build a matrix of what people feel comfortable with and how they can collaborate on this kind of documentation. And it will be, of course, not the same as mine. You'll have different results. It will depend on the people. It will also maybe depend on the type of project. So the last question I usually have is, when do you have time to document all of that? And usually I document the final and tested components and pages, because for me it doesn't make sense to document the wireframe if it's not validated. So I usually also document once we had the discussion about technical feasibility with the developers. So what I document is what is supposed to be normally, unless we have some bad surprises at some point, what is supposed to be implemented in the stories. So the last part is really, really nice to have all this documentation, but what are the benefits of that? Which is also kind of, okay, how do I convince my team, my manager, people to invest in such documentation? First thing is benefits for myself as a designer and for my design team to learn more about accessibility, because in order to build such documentation and also to prepare this talk, I had to read a lot of articles along the way, and I also have to keep updated with accessibility, like WCAG standards and all of that. It's a moving standard. We are 2.1. 2.2 is being prepared. So in order to document accessibility, you need to kind of get interested in the topic. So documentation is kind of a nice way to maybe force you to learn about something. It also forces you to think about different interaction beyond the static pixel I'm working on. Like I open Figma or Sketch and I have these static mockups, but then having this kind of documentation is an interesting mental effort because it forces you to take a step back and ask myself, okay, how will this work with a mouse, with a keyboard, with a touch? And sometimes you discover that something you had in mind is actually not going to work. And then you go back to the drawing board and you rethink your components. It's also a good onboarding tool for people who don't know anything about accessibility. Like if you have newcomers in the team, seeing this kind of documentation gives them good examples of what is expected of them. It also will kind of open questions like, oh, but why do we do it like that? What's a screen reader maybe? Or, okay, what is this 4.5 contrast ratio? Things like that. Next benefit is for the designer-developer collaboration and relationship. So design documentation helps me gain a lot of time, which is a little bit weird to say, and avoid mistakes and misinterpretations. So what you have to understand is at some point, the developer will have to build a component. So if you don't document all the state of a button, someone will have to build it. So someone will have to take time to take that decision. So if you don't document such thing up front in the project, in the design phase, then the kind of time you gained by not doing that is going to triple at the end of the project, because you'll have to have some developer take this kind of decision and they will take more time than a designer who's actually used to designing such things. Also, there can be months between the moment we talked about the components, we put it in the backlog, and the moment that Jira tickets arrive to my dev team. And having this good documentation is kind of a good reminder of what we discussed before and make sure that we are still on the same page 6 months after that. It helps bring consistency to the future pages and interactions. So if something works one way, maybe a component that is doing almost the same thing should work the same way. And my developers usually hold me accountable for that. Like they would ask, but look, Stephanie, this is almost the same component. Why is it working differently? Well, it should not. You're totally right. So I will change the component and make sure it's consistent. And last benefit is for everyone in the team. So seeing such documentation, it helps start a conversation about accessibility within the company, and it also encourages people to dig a little bit further to make sure that accessibility is not an afterthought anymore, but part of the project at each stage, starting with designer requirements. So today I shared a lot of things with you, like a lot, things that you can document as a designer. The goal is to give you plenty of examples. I'll be honest with you, I don't have the time to document all of that in all my design mockups. So my advice to you is pick your battles. If time is limited, document the things that might cause issue, where you might have miscommunication problem, misunderstanding with the development team. The important part at the end of the day is teamwork. It's all about communication. What are the most important aspects with your team, with design team, developer team, even with tester team. This way, we can all push accessibility forward together in the project and build better and more accessible products. Thanks for coming to my talk, and see you in person maybe one day. Yay! Fun.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, Stéphanie Walter, to Clarity. Thank you for joining us remotely. Before we dig into anything, I really want to talk about that sticker that is on your microphone.
It depends.
It's so great.
Yeah.
I love it. Oh, that is
some
so
independent
awesome.
stickers. Yeah.
That's so cool. There's been a lot of it depends in the channel as we've been going through this talk, and a lot of good questions. And you have given us so many amazing examples and even different ways to document different parts of the process. I've seen some folks talk in Figma about, or talk in Brella about using Figma. You mentioned Jira and some other tools. There's just so much good stuff in there. So thank you for that talk. Thank you for that resource that has a whole guide. I know everybody is sharing it with their teams immediately.
Please do push it. Push your teams. That's the goal. That's why we do these talks.
Absolutely. And oh gosh, it's so good. There's so many nuggets in there of just pure gold. And I imagine too, as we maybe start to take these back to teams, or that people really absorb what you just shared, that there are going to be concerns that maybe come up, maybe some pushback regarding speed or timelines, and being able to take the time to factor all of this in. So how do you respond to that question? Doesn't it take a lot of time and slow down projects to do this?
So usually my answer is, well, if you skip on some of the design parts, someone will have to take the decision. So at the end of the day, if you say, yo, we don't have time to document all the button states, guess who will have to develop them anyway? Developers. So if you don't do that, then developer will have to either take the decisions on their own, or they will have to go back and forth and ask to the designer again. So you didn't really gain any time. Maybe you even lost some time, because then they need to track the designer who did that, and there will be a lot of back and forth and stuff like that. It's the same for the complex components. It's like a lot of designers, especially beginners, and this is not like kind of a criticism. It's like, you're like, oh, I drew this component, it's amazing, let's give it to developers. But then they're like, yeah, but it's kind of missing some of the steps. So what is happening between these steps and stuff like that? So if you don't document them, at least try to find some time to discuss with the developers, maybe do a quick drawing. If like time is limited, you don't have to go into super detailed documentation like I should. That's what I was saying at the end of the talk, is like pick your battles. But you need to know that if something is not documented and it needs to be developed, the question will pop at some point. So anything not documented by the design team will need to be done, documented, implemented by someone else who might take actually more time than a team of designers to do so. So it's not kind of gaining sometimes. It's like when you construct a house, if you like skip times on some of the essential basics, then you might have to redo them afterwards, or someone will have to take a decision on where do we put the door or stuff like that. So it's the same.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. It's adding more to the process. Another thing that I thought about was, at least even in the product world, how this could actually save time for support teams because they're addressing a lot of UX issues, a lot of accessibility issues all the time. And so designers benefit, developers benefit, the user benefits, the support team benefits. I think even the onboarding of new team members, like that, all of this is just so amazing. And there's just so much good stuff in there. I feel like we just got extra stuff in our swag bag to learn from. That's very exciting. The other part that was really interesting to me was that matrix of competencies, because I was thinking about, are the designers taking on more? And I love your approach of developers being involved, docs and content writers being involved, PMs being involved. That is, I think somebody said it in the chat, it might have been Morgane saying that like we need to show that to every leader. And I know that that is in the link that you shared. So everybody share that link with your teams. But thinking about that and picking our battles, I'm also thinking about a lot of the conversations that have happened in Slack and Umbrella about being the DS team of one. How can our DS teams of one get the support that they need from those non-design team members?
I would say I would apply kind of a user research process to that, because the design system is a product, So it would be try to maybe conduct some research on yourself, which is a little bit weird, but like do the matrix. Try to understand what you can do by yourself, and then where do you need help with. And then it would be go and research and do some interviews with the other people on the team and try to understand how they might be able to help with that. It's like I know some SEO people are really, really technical and know a lot about accessibility. So maybe you don't have an accessibility expert in the team, but maybe someone else who doesn't have the job title of accessibility expert, but still knows a lot, or something like that. So I would say to help here, you need, again, like to reach out to other people. And I don't remember who said, I'm bad at name, but someone talked about the fact that we should not hide mistakes. And here it's not about, I would say we should not hide mistakes, like previous mistakes, but also we should not hide when we need help. When we say, here, I am at my limit, I need help with that, please, can I go to someone else? So I would try to understand the kind of strength of everyone in the team and see how they might be able to pitch in. And it's like I have a colleague who's a developer, and he doesn't know a lot about accessibility, but he's super eager to help and he's super eager to learn. So he's like, yeah, let's build this together. If we need help, I can find you articles, things like that. So it's really about building a community around that. And even if you are the only designer in the team, you're not the only person in the team. Otherwise, I think you have other problems than a design. It's like you might have bigger problems and a lot. Yeah, but so there's other people to help on your team. So it would be like find strength in this team and see how you can create this kind of synergies between people.
That's really amazing. I love that you just talked about asking for help. Even what you referenced of, if a sketch is what you can do with your time, it kind of goes back to some of the themes that we're seeing yesterday. Look at your team, do the research, take a step back on what the needs and contexts are, and find find people who can help out and really own those areas. So I think that is amazing. So I know we are getting pretty close to lunchtime. Again, want to, before we get to that, talk about all of the amazing resources that you have. You have shared the article you wrote, which is pretty much your talk. You've shared some other great resources in the chat. I know there's a group of people that are working in a doc share, putting in all the links that are being shared in the chat. You also shared that Figma template, which I am so excited to start using immediately because I loved all of your arrows and I saw that they were in there. All of that is really great. But now I want to get to a very important question just before we wrap up. I need to know what your favorite pizza is.
Haha. So it's always really weird when I order that, but I love vegetables. And in a lot of Italian restaurants, you got like this pizza with zucchinis and eggplants and stuff. So I would go to the vegetable pizza and I ask for extra bacon. And they would look at me in the weirdest way. So it's really, really fun to see the waiter like, huh? So you want the vegetarian one? Yeah, with bacon or ham. It's like, yes, please. It's like, okay. So I want the vegetables, that's but a little bit of ham on top of it.
I love it. I've had zucchini on a pizza, but I don't think I've had eggplant on a pizza. And that sounds really, really good.
It's amazing. Ooh. Grilled eggplants on pizza.
Oh gosh. Okay. Yep. I'm getting hungry. So before we go to our breaks in lunch, which don't go quite yet, folks, stick around for a couple more minutes. Where can our online folks follow you online?
So StéphanieWalter.design is my website. On Twitter, I'm Walter Stephanie because the other one was already taken. And Stéphanie Walter Pro on LinkedIn. And if you add me on LinkedIn, just put a note. You don't need a paid account. You can just put on like, hi, we met at Clarity, so that I know where you know me from. It's always nice to have contacts when people connect. So yeah, Great. Definitely. Reach out.
Thank you.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Then.
Yeah, we're gonna go to lunch soon. Everyone, please put your hands together. Round of applause for Stéphanie.